I think we're going to make a start. Welcome all, and thank you so much for joining us to our lunchtime talk, Net Zero, what does it mean and how do we get there? I'm Gesine Kippenberg, Head of Professional Programs. I think I'm not sure we're going to have all the answers today, but we'll aim to clarify definitions, responsibilities, and scope for change. And we have with us today a number of speakers who are all really leading in the field of sustainability, and all members also of LETI, and really pleased that they took the time out of their always very busy diaries. So thank you, Jane Anderson of Construction LCA, Will Arnold, who's Head of Climate Action at the Institute of Structural Engineers, Louisa Bowles, Sustainability Lead at Hawkins Brown, Jess Rifnak, our own Sustainable Development Advisor, and Dr. Joe Jack Williams, who's Researcher and Associate at Field and Clegg Bradley, to be with us today, so thank you. What we are going to do, we actually thought, rather than just have an open discussion, we'll be starting with very short presentations from each of our panelists, so 3 to 5 minutes each, to introduce definitions of net zero, to discuss strategies for reducing operational and embodied carbon, then looking at materials, and finally the role of offsetting. And then afterwards we'll have 20 to 25 minutes time for discussions, and obviously your questions are very welcome, so do please post them in the chat, or you'll also have an opportunity later, just raise your hand and ask them verbally. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Louisa, who will start with a short talk on definitions of net zero. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Just wait for the slides to pop up. That's brilliant. Thank you. Right. So yeah, I'm going to kick off with definitions and targets. Next one. So the first slide shows the life cycle stages. So the primary structure for measuring and talking about carbon emissions in buildings is taken from the BSEN 15978. Lots of numbers. This diagram shows the key principles. So it's just good to have a good grounding if we're all not familiar. So the whole life carbon is comprised of both operational emissions from energy and water. They're shown in yellow at the bottom of that diagram, and embodied carbon from the materials. They're shown in the various shades of pink. Within our whole life carbon calculation, which is the big blue dotted box, there are a number of life cycle stages that break down the carbon emitted by materials and things at the various stages of a project. It's probably worth noting, if you don't know, also that a standard life cycle calculation is carried out over 60 years for buildings and 120 years for infrastructure. That's the framework that we work within in the UK. So, for example, the A's, which is the dark pink, cover what we call upfront carbon, the emissions from the extraction, the manufacture, transport of materials, product up to practical completion. The B's cover the in-use stage, so including those from any maintenance or replacement cycles, and then the energy and the water. The C's cover the emissions that are generated at the end of life of a building, so deconstructing and disposing it. Module D, as it is known, is in the dark green towards the right hand side of that diagram, currently sits outside of a whole life carbon calculation. It represents the potential of materials and components to be reused and recovered rather than disposed of, but it's not included at the moment because firstly there's a range of scenarios that you could calculate, and it's so uncertain that it's deemed not sensible to include it in the whole boundary at the moment. And then the slide, for the purposes of recording, shows other guidance that is out there at the moment. Next one. So on definitions, in May 2021, so quite recently, a number of industry groups came together to launch a suite of information aimed at demystifying embodied carbon performance, and then also the term net zero carbon. And this slide shows the range of definitions that group constructed, and they can be downloaded from the LETI website. There's a link there at the bottom on the slide. And we found that the term net zero is often used in briefs to describe a number of different things, which is why the definitions were really important. It's because it's really important that we're clear with our design teams and our clients that we're all talking about the same thing, so that each performance is comparable. For example, it's possible for a building to achieve net zero operational energy, but the same building might not achieve net zero whole life, for example. Next one. So there are too many definitions. There's quite a lot of pages in that document, so I'd urge you to go and have a look. But for the purposes of the discussion today, these are the two key ones that relate to net zero whole life carbon. And as I've said, whole life carbon is the addition of all the life cycle stages A to C. So therefore, if it's achieved, it represents really the pinnacle of performance. And you can see that there are a lot of inputs in a carbon calculation and not yet many opportunities to reduce those, at least on site. So renewable energy might be one, carbon storage and natural materials is another, but they're very rarely enough to bring that sum to zero. So in order to reach net zero carbon, it's widely accepted at the current time that you need to facilitate that with offsets. And there will be a bit more about that later in the series of slides. But what was critical for the definition was that it needed to include the aspiration that we must minimize our emissions before we're relying on offsets. So next one. So this chart is included in the definitions document and was intended to provide a pathway for designers to understand what they needed to do, and clients and teams to understand what they needed to do to achieve a net zero carbon building. So the important thing to note really is that net zero performance across the whole life cycle of a building is an ongoing activity, and it will be passed from different members of the team throughout the life of that building. So it would be passed from design team to contractor to client to manager, landlord, tenant, and it's not a one-off event. And key milestone events are effectively to offset emissions at practical completion based on an as-built embodied carbon assessment, to measure and report all your emissions annually during the building use, and then finally to measure and offset emissions at the end of life. Next one. And finally, this is my final slide, but a word on targets. So this really is the missing piece of the puzzle. So how can we meet the definition without them? But I would say at the moment they are somewhat elusive, let's say, and they will probably be changing rapidly over the next few years as we increase the learning and the data sets. It's really important, I think, to understand that we're very early in our journey on understanding embodied carbon, how to measure it consistently, much earlier than we are for operational energy, for example. This slide represents the progress that's been made to date. So data sets have been analysed for the most common typologies. Hopefully you can see that a few of those columns there: office, resi, education, retail, and a range of performance levels set. And we have tried to indicate as LETI, where we think building as usual is good, a good performance now, and suggested a pathway for improvement, and then linked those obviously to the REBA 2030 climate challenge targets. So they're now all aligned much more than they were, say, even a couple of months ago. But from my personal point of view, and this might engender a series of questions, doesn't mean, unfortunately, that we've cracked the answer necessarily. You build to these levels and you can achieve net zero. So I think firstly, there's obviously topologies missing. Secondly, the numbers are not yet linked to a top-down understanding of the UK's carbon budget, growth projections, what might constitute a Paris-proof number, let's say. There's work ongoing across the industry to try and get to a more robust level. But thirdly, we've got to make sure everyone's measuring consistently. And finally, I think it's really important to recognise that in the industry at the moment, there's also no current certification scheme, let's say, for achieving net zero. And the best we can do is target something sensible, aspirational, commit to reducing, and then publicly disclosing our results and sharing knowledge so that we can move forward. So I'm going to hand over now to Jess, I think. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So why do we care about reducing operational energy when we're talking about net zero? Well, because we are agnostic to the source of that energy. So we care about reducing demand, irrespective of it's 100% renewable or fossil fuel, because if I overconsume, even if it's renewable source, that means I take away the ability from somebody else to access that through my overconsumption, because we have a believe that every resource is precious. So it's the reducing the demand is the important bit. Sorry, my slides are not skipping forwards. Okay, so the in-use, the operational energy is the in-use bit that I'm going to be talking to. It's the messy, it represents that central band on the slide, the messiness of life. It's influenced by external factors such as how cold a season is, but also our own activities inside the building. And in the equation, the constructed building is the constant. The operational energy is the thing that we need to, as Louisa said, refer to balance out on an annual basis. And then if we have a crystal ball into the future, we have a figure of what happens to the disposal at the end of life, but then also the opportunities in module D of reusing, which could then plug in to a new equation for a new project. Oh, apologies, that was a double click. I can't seem to go backwards. So the architect's influence is predominantly through the design at the early stages, in the actual material choices and the form and method, and using materials as effectively and efficiently as possible. And that obviously impacts on how often it has to be maintained, its longevity, and its of the potential for its reuse, but also how the toxicity and the end of life disposal. However, as you can see on those two end bits, it's not all within the architect's gift. What actually happens in reality when a building is dismantled is not within control, as is the essential part of the in-use, how the building is used and the activities that are carried out inside the building is not in the architect's control. However, we need to look at the interaction between the building and minimize the operational energy use to undertake those activities. So making sure that we crack all of those really first principle things, the passive elements, make sure that the building works with the environment, looking at orientation, make the fabric work effectively and efficiently, and provide the resultant services in the least carbon intensive way. And key to that operational energy demand reduction is understanding the usage and the usage patterns that will take place in the building. So here's an example at Helis National Trust, a fantastic collaboration, Field and Clegg Bradley Studios in Ratsfordham, where you can see a lot of work went into the embodied carbon as well as the orientation and form of the building, and yet in the blue on the top of on the right hand graph, you can see that actual energy use was still quite high, and that's down to the IT load as well as the kitchens, where it transpired on a post-occupancy evaluation visit that there was a continuous dishwasher in constant use throughout the day dishwashing. So thinking about IT, and as we all know, incredibly important, and thinking of that and incorporating that as one of the building systems, so that you think about how is that building going to be operated. Is there a way of powering down parts of the building, parts of the floor plate, if there's going to be out of hours or extensive weekend work, so that you're not using a lot of energy for one person working in isolation. Also talking about the adaptive comfort, how much are people willing to you know, remove clothing or put jumpers on? How much can you relax the set points? And then considering how much control do you want to give people. People like to be able to open the window themselves. They like to be able to interact and feel that they have control of the their thermal environment. But also, how much do you want things to be automated to be able to get some larger scale efficiencies throughout the seasons? But then the architect's role is to really think about how that space is going to be used and avoid the unintended consequences. Does the classroom have enough pinboard space? Does it have enough place to put up artwork so that the windows don't have to be used and therefore the daylight reduced and lights to be on continuously? So the architect's role is really to work within the design and use the design to nudge people to do the right thing and thus be able to positively influence behaviour and reduce energy demand. And I shall now hand over to the next speaker.
I believe it's me next. Yeah, there we go. There we are. So I'm just going to touch briefly on strategies for reducing embodied carbon, and I'm probably not going to talk for very long because it's reasonably straightforward. Can somebody put the next slide up, please? And the reason why I say that is because of this pie chart, and you might have seen variations of this in LETI documents and RIBA documents and so on and so forth. But in essence, what it tells you is that in embodied carbon terms, somewhere around 2/3 of the embodied carbon of your building is due to the structure. That's the superstructure and substructure combined and the construction of those things. So 2/3 of it's in there, and the remaining third is split up typically with about half of that in the facade, and then the rest is your finishes, your MEP equipment and so on and so forth. So in terms of embodied carbon, it really is about trying to prioritise reductions in those areas with the most carbon in them in the first place, getting hold of the low-hanging fruit, as it were. Next slide, please. So this is the iStruct's sort of hierarchy towards doing this that we give to structural engineers. It's got the word structure in it a few times, but you could probably replace some of those with materials or something if you wanted to use this more generally. But if we look at the right-hand part of the diagram from the top down, you see that the sorts of impacts you have from building nothing or just building less, they're going to be the sort of big impact decisions you can make from an embodied carbon point of view. Minimising waste, prefabrication, local sourcing to minimise transport emissions, these are all good too, but will usually have a much smaller impact than just building nothing, building less, and so on. And of course, don't forget that when we're talking about embodied carbon, we're not just talking about upfront embodied carbon, which is everything leading up to construction and handing the keys over. We're talking about embodied carbon through the life of the building. And so whilst on the structural side of things, you wouldn't expect to replace anything during the 60 years, you might top up the paintwork on something that's exposed and external maybe, but that would be about it. Obviously, things are a bit different for facade, MEP, fit out. And so just bear in mind through the whole life of the building, how many times are you going to replace certain things, and what can you do to do that less. Last thing I'd say on this slide before I flick to the next one, which will be my final slide, is just to highlight that in the middle of this we have build clever, which says next to it appropriate structural configurations, and that's different to the one below under build efficiently, which says highly utilised structures. And the reason I wanted to point that out to you, as I've got a room full of architects listening to me over your lunch, is that it obviously is great to speak to your engineer and say to them, make sure those structures are designed to the bone, utilise them as highly as you can. But the impact that you'll have on your embodied carbon emissions from doing that is never going to be as great as the impact you could have through getting the configuration of the structure right in the first place. And by that time, when I'm talking about structural configuration, I'm talking about straightforward load paths to ground, avoiding transfer structures, sensible spans, all of these sorts of things that if you were to sit down at the start of the project with your structural engineer and ask them how to go about doing these things and what would be the most efficient way to do them, I'm sure they'd have lots of answers. And lots of them would tell you that, of course, they feel that they come into the process too late, but I'll leave you to discuss that with them. Next slide, please. And this is my final bit. This just really tries to pick up a flavour of that structural, that sort of efficient concept of structure that I'm talking about. These drivers that I've tried to sort of brain dump onto the screen, these are reasons why I think some of the decisions on this building might have been made. So I don't know anything about this building. It's on Oxford Street somewhere. I took this photo about 9 months ago when I was walking past, and I thought, oh, interesting T columns there near the floor, because that's what I like, that kind of thing. But when you start to unpick it, you realise that, of course, you know, the column spacing has been driven by certain things. The beam to slab depth has been driven by certain things. And all of these drivers, generally speaking, you end up decreasing the depth of beam you have available, or you widen the column spacing, or you add a basement, you build a new structure instead of retaining. And they're all driven by these factors that we've been used to working with for years and decades. And we need to start changing our mindset now and asking, is that worth it? When the result of it is that all of these decisions have increased the embodied carbon of that building in front of you. That's it for me. Thanks.
So I'm going to take over and talk to you a little bit about how materials can help you achieve net zero. Next slide. So these are slides taken from the industrial decarbonisation roadmaps. And you can see this is showing you from 2012 through to 2050. And this is for cement and steel, the kind of two materials that are commonly used for structure, which Will showed you have major influence on embodied carbon emissions. Even with kind of the maximum types of reduction strategy that were thought of when this report came out in 2015, we were only getting to a 60% reduction for both steel and concrete by 2050. So basically materials are not going to be, you know, the decarbonisation of materials isn't going to get us where we need to. We have got to do a lot of other things as well. That said, there are lots of these reductions going on. There are lots of things that material producers are doing. So please look at environmental product declarations, EPD, to try and find materials that have reductions. That's definitely something you should do. Next slide. So the other material which is often sort of suggested is the solution, particularly to net zero, is timber. So I just wanted to explain a little bit about how we actually look at timber and what it means in terms of net zero. So in terms of the timber life cycle, timber as it's growing, forests and trees as they grow, and this is the same for other types of biomass, they take carbon, they sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is a really positive thing. And when we talk about offsetting, planting forests is one of the ways in which countries offset and which projects can also offset. That timber is then harvested and used to actually produce timber products. And for this context, we're talking about construction. And around half of all timber that's harvested is going into timber products for construction at the moment in the UK, for example, more in some other countries. When those products go into construction, effectively that carbon that's sequestered in them, that stays stored out of the atmosphere. And again, that has a really positive, it's a positive effect in terms of climate change, the fact that that carbon is stored in buildings, rather than, for example, if we used it as energy, it would be released back into the atmosphere, and that would be causing climate change again. So the longer we can keep carbon out of the atmosphere, there is a benefit from that. And at end of life, if we're able to recycle timber and reuse timber, which again in the UK is common, certainly more common than quite a lot of countries, then that carbon can stay back in buildings for another 50, 100 years again. And all of this is really, really positive. There is a difference, however, in terms of how this is looked at in terms of the way that we calculate embodied and upfront carbon and this kind of the way it looks. And we've seen problems in the way people are talking about their building being net zero or even carbon negative because they're using timber, and effectively that isn't possible. It isn't the way that it works. If we can go on to the next slide. So when we calculate using the standards that Louisa talked about, and we use these definitions that we've developed, effectively, if you look here, upfront carbon, it doesn't include sequestered carbon. So it's basically just the impacts of producing products. You're not able to include the benefit of sequestration in your upfront carbon figure. And if you look at embodied carbon over the whole life cycle of the product, the sequestered carbon that's taken up into the product is either released or transferred here at the end of life. And so again, there is a balance. So for both of these, it's actually not possible to have a negative carbon result from using timber or biomass. You will always have an impact that's associated with it. So from that point of view, this carbon sequestration isn't the answer to net zero, other than using it as an offset, which is certainly possible. There are benefits from using timber, and that's because timber, certainly some timber structures, can have lower impacts than conventional concrete and steel structures. It does depend what you're trying to do, but there are certainly examples and lots of projects where that's been shown to be the case. And you can also, if you're using timber, for example, as cladding or the structure, flooring, those types of things, again, it can have lower impacts than alternative materials. Next slide. So the answer in terms of what we actually need to get to net zero is to use materials efficiently. And again, this is one of the problems with timber, is that we only have a limited amount of timber. It's a renewable material. We've only got a certain land area to grow it. So we need to use that timber as efficiently as possible in as many buildings as possible, so that it can offset more intensive, carbon intensive materials. So we need to, there is no benefit to using more timber in your building than you need, because it sequesters carbon. That won't actually change your upfront or your embodied carbon figure as a benefit. In fact, it will increase it because you're using more timber with more impact. The only way you can use it and use timber is when you're replacing other materials, and then you only need to use as much as you need. This is the same for things like recycled metals, GGBS in concrete. There's only a certain amount of these materials, so using more in your building might make your building better, but it doesn't make construction better as a whole. And we have to have solutions that work kind of at a big scale. So basically, use your materials as efficiently as possible, try to get the optimum functionality from the materials you're using, consider the whole life cycle. This will give us the lowest carbon, and that's what we basically need. So thank you, that's me.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about offsetting and actually the kind of final process in this, which is obviously why I'm coming last. It's also easier to go last because everybody's there. So I think the first question is understanding when's offsetting appropriate. Now we're talking about net zero carbon, not absolute zero carbon. So as you've heard, Jess and Louisa and Jane and Will talk about actually the kind of efficiencies that need to come with it. So first thing to do, as Louisa mentioned, is to find what your scope and boundaries are. You know, understand whether it's operational, is it upfront carbon, is it whole life carbon, to really understand that, and then understand that you've really got to minimize in the first instance. You were getting down to this final lump. This lump shown in yellow, the final kind of lump of carbon, if you manage to get rid of that and got it down to zero, that would be absolute zero carbon. We currently don't think it's necessarily possible. It maybe is, but I find it kind of difficult to understand how you do it. So this is the kind of lump you get to at the end. You've made it all efficient, and this is where offsetting comes in. So it could be at the start of your project. You know, it's appropriate as defined by the whole life carbon networks definitions, but it tells you when you should be looking at offsetting. Once you've got to this stage, it's then a case of understanding what we should be looking at in terms of how we actually offset it. So if you go on to the next slide. Smashing. So this is liberally borrowed from the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting. It is a fantastic document. I'd recommend you all read it. This is only a very short summary, but in effect, there's two broad types of offsetting. There's emission reduction and there's carbon removal. In terms of a reduction, the first thing on the left is avoidance. So this is about reducing carbon emissions elsewhere. So a really classic one is a PV panel, say, but it could be about cleaner stoves in Africa. That was all the rage a few years ago. Or it could be about improving other people's homes so they use slightly less energy. What do these do? It's an important point of our process towards zero carbon. We've got to make sure everybody can get to zero carbon, but what it doesn't do is store any carbon. So the next kind of steps within this are reduction, and it's short and long-term storage. So short storage is protecting ecosystems. So maybe you buy a bit of forest and you look after it and keep it going. Or you take a practice that already stores carbon and you improve that and make that work slightly more efficiently. In terms of long-term storage, what we're really looking at is things like carbon capture and storage, in effect. And just a bit of a definition. So when we talk short storage, we're talking decades, maybe 100 years. Long storage, if you think the oil that we dug out of the ground, that took 120 million years to be there, that kind of region. That's long storage. We want to have things that are in the ground for eons, not for decades. We don't want to be seeing that ever bubbling up, far outlasting the realms of human existence, if you like. That's the goal. So carbon capture and storage is all about how do you get it to aiming for that kind of length, if at all possible. Carbon removal then is about removal of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So it's about taking the stuff that's already in the atmosphere and taking it back out, and which is kind of resetting where we need to be. So the most obvious one is afforestation or reforestation. So actually planting a forest. It could be about soil carbon enhancement. It could be about ecosystem restoration. How do you make a peat bog again or something like that? Again, those are the kind of short-term aspects. Removal in terms of long storage is where we start to look at processes such as BECCS or DACS, which has carbon capture within it, but as a slight difference to the reduction. So in reduction, what we're doing is we're looking at processes that already exist. So industry, for instance, steel or concrete manufacture or fossil fuel power stations. When we start to look at the carbon removal, actually what we're doing is we're in the bioenergy, we're looking at converting carbon in biosinks or biogenic carbon into energy and capturing all that carbon that's in it and then turn it into some sort of fossilized version. Direct air is where we're actually just using energy to take carbon out of the atmosphere. So both of them really good. Both of them very new technology. DRAX is, I think, a bioenergy or carbon capture storage power station. It's taking biofuel and then turning it into mineralization. Very early days, but this is a really good start point. I'd have a look at the Oxford offsetting principles. And if you go to the next slide. Just a bit more about the principles. UK Green Building Council have got a really good offsetting principles section. Go have a look at it. If you go search for UK GBC, renewable energy procurement and carbon offsetting, it's all in there. They've got a nice list. I'm just going to pick out a couple of the key bits in here. Additional, being really important. If you think that whatever you're doing would happen without you investing in it in terms of offsetting, it's probably not offsetting. I think that's really important to know. If you're investing in a wind farm off the North Sea, which is incredibly lucrative, that's probably not offsetting. If you're building a wind turbine on your site that you know can exist without you, that probably is offsetting. So just think about, are you doing this in terms of additional to what would already happen? And I also just note, independently verified and unique. Unique, if it's independently verified, it should be unique. But what you really want to be able to do is make sure that somebody has the paperwork to say that it's real and can be counted. And I would also suggest that if you can, you do it in some way that you can go visit and independently audit. On the right are some resources. I would start with the Oxford Principles, Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, UK GBC. They've all got lots of links to places that really do factor in, whether it's Woodland Carbon Code or other places where you can actually start to buy carbon credits. All fantastic. But on that point, I'll leave it there and we can come back to these in questions if needs be. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone. 5 really excellent short presentations. Before we get on to the questions, I would just briefly like to use the opportunity to mention also our Smart Practice Conference, which we launched today. It will take place at the end of September for more speakers on the climate challenge and sustainable design. So now we've had a few comments come in the chat. And let me see, where do we start that from the, so there was a question about the climate challenge, the metrics that have been updated, whether that's to secure the LETI alignment, and yes. So LETI and REBA have been working together to obviously align the targets to develop a coherent industry standard. Now, someone mentions, yeah, don't forget overheating to avoid carbon emissions arising from active cooling. That will imagine become an increasing issue. Then someone asked, Richard asked, how does the circular economy come into the net zero discussion? So I think, Louisa, you actually addressed that briefly at the beginning. It's not yet included in the calculation.
So, I mean, you need to assess Module D, but effectively, if you're using recycled materials, you're reducing your impacts, and that's where that benefit is counted. If you're recycling at end of life, if you've been using primary materials, then you show that benefit in Module D. One of the problems with Module D is if you use recycled materials, you don't get a benefit for recycling. So that's why it's difficult to take it into account.
Yeah, I could add to that. There's 2 points which we found it plays out. So obviously a major part of the circular economy is refurbishment and retrofit, and the targets don't make a distinction between whether you're building new build or refurbishment purposefully, because the idea is that as we refurbish more, we will naturally be reducing our overall or at building level carbon emissions. So it's another incentive, hopefully, to more of those projects coming forward. I think the second point is that sometimes, depending on the nature of the circular economy mechanism employed, it could or could not increase or decrease your carbon. So there's a hierarchy in terms of the way the circular economy works. If you are directly taking a piece of material off one building and using it in another, that you're probably paying for the transport. But if you're having to reprocess that material into something that is then suitable for the new use, then you're putting energy into doing that. So there's a really interesting LETI project ongoing at the moment around the conflicts and the tensions. So there may be a paper or a thought piece issued over the next few months.
Thank you. I have to say, I also thought it was interesting what you said at the beginning about the fact that we haven't yet linked the targets to a UK carbon budget. I wonder if maybe, sorry, Lisa, to come back to you, or if someone else would want to address that. So basically, that would mean what we really need to look at, or what is sort of the suppose most pragmatic approach, to look at the national carbon budget and then relate any target across any industry really to that, rather than say, okay, I'm just looking at my individual building unit, or I mean that will obviously be important, but overall, yeah.
There's a massive project going on at the moment, which is the UK GBC Net Zero Whole Life Carbon Roadmap to 2050. Bit of a mouthful, and a number of us on the panel are part of that work. And so that is a huge piece of work going on to remodel some modelling that was done about 8 years ago, I think, and trying to make some of these predictions. But that's what they are. They're sort of taking a baseline and then manipulating a model. But the hope from Letty's point of view, at least, and then I think a lot of the other panelists would be able to comment on this, was that we could take some of those benchmarks and performance levels, in the next few months, once the UK GBC work has been launched, and see if there's a more time-based approach to setting targets. But that's a piece of work that I think still needs doing. I might hand over to another panelist now.
Can I just comment on that? I think it's a really important point about understanding what the kind of trajectory is. And I do think it's important that we have a kind of realistic target we work towards. By the same token, we should all just be doing as much as we possibly can, regardless And I think it's important that we kind of have these kind of, it needs to be, it'd be really exciting when the UK GBC finish their bit of work and hopefully they come out with a kind of definitive sort of response. The flip side is, until that point, actually, if you're not working hard in reducing your carbon, you're not working hard enough, and it kind of becomes immaterial of what your outcome is, as long as you're working as hard as possible.
I think Jess had her hand up first, and then Will.
Well, Will, is your point related to the discussion? I was just going to pick off one of the other incoming questions. So if yours is directly related, you go ahead and then I'll... It is,
and it's brief, and I'll keep it brief. And it's just to say that, I mean, the thing we need more than anything in terms of targets and making targets better, and by better, I mean getting them to align with what we're currently doing and working out where we're going to go from there. The thing we need more than anything else is data. So if you're listening to this and you've been looking at the carbon footprint of the stuff that you have designed, please share it. Either send it to people you know at Reba or at Letty. There's email addresses. Send it to one of us. We'll pass it on to people. The targets that are out there are based on a few hundred buildings, and we build tens of thousands of buildings. So we need a lot more data. That's it.
Thank you, Will.
Yes. Go.
Great. Okay. I was just going to respond to Bob Eden's question about tangible incentives for less broad-minded clients. Well, we know that in 2050 we've got UK national legislation which we are, we'll all have to meet. So, we fully expect that as we get closer to that 2050 deadline, there will be more and more hard and fast and tangible incentives. And it is always in any client's interest to stay ahead of the curve from a purely business perspective. So we know that there are mega trends happening. Lots of clients are reflecting on this, that the public is much more aware of sustainability and particularly net zero. So there is a lot of focus on that from buyers, from general public, and the sort of scrutiny of this, and therefore there are a lot of companies and businesses looking at what net zero business models look like, and their offices, their buildings, the premises they operate out of are part of that bigger picture. And I think it's really important to kind of frame it in terms of their business and the competition. If this is where things are going, it is absolutely will affect their bottom line if they're not seen as keeping up with everybody else. So it's not about the immediate return, but it's about long-term sort of business strategy. And I think that's where there are definite merits and benefits that you sort of pass on to clients.
Thank you, Jess. Before I get on to another participant's viewer's question, I'm wondering, and please, don't feel put on the spot. We're already 2 minutes before our scheduled session time ends. I don't know if you're all about to jump onto the next meeting, or if anyone is still happy to hang around for a little while longer, as there seem to be quite a lot of questions. Yeah, okay. Obviously, do just say you have to go when you have to go. So I think maybe Matt has his hand up. Matt Burton, do you want to come in and ask verbally?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's very interesting for me. This is the first Reba call I've actually been involved in, and we obviously come from a slightly different side of the business, because we're obviously a tech, consumer electronics and business brand buying, used consumer phones and tech, and we have a complete circular economy. 95% of everything the Music Magpie buys in is either re-commerced or resold back out to the consumer. 10% of our product is reused for parts. And it's very interesting that we talk about how we could reuse building materials, but other things that companies I think can look at is their mobile phones that they probably have stuck in their drawers and in their IT departments. We can give second lives to those, and people like us give second lives. 85% of a cell phone's CO2 emissions is actually apologies, there's something ringing about. 85% is actually on its production in the first 2 years. So producing a new mobile phone costs a lot of money. We obviously don't mind new mobile phones. because, you know, everyone likes to increase their tech and improve their tech every year, it seems. So it's just about getting the apathy. The biggest competitor, we've always said, to Music Magpie is people and businesses' apathy to do anything with their mobile phones and their drawers. And that is something that we can all do as companies, is go to your IT teams, say, have we got 100 phones lying around or 1,000 phones lying around? And what can we do with them? Because otherwise they're going to end up in landfill. And landfill, it's, you know, e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream. We did a survey of 2,000 people in the UK. 4 out of 5 people did not know what e-waste was. And out of those, when we told them, 54% of people said that they didn't think it was harmful to the environment. And I think my last point will be that someone like Play It Green, if you look at playitgreen.com, I've checked them out heavily, and I planted 299 trees last night just by signing up my family to carbon offset. And you can actually carbon offset your whole business. You can carbon offset concerts. I mean, it's a great initiative. So they've currently got a forest in Madagascar, and actually they're about to buy land in Scotland, and they'll be using drone technology to seed that forest. So it's a clever business. The website is amazing to use, and in 10 minutes I was planted 299 trees. So
okay, thank you, Matt. Yeah, Joe, does that sound like a safe way to offset?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that there's a kind of social benefit to planting, and Madagascar's got a huge amount of deforestation. In fact, we did a lemur sanctuary out in Madagascar, so we spent a lot of time looking at the hidden carbon emissions of Madagascar in particular. What I would say is it's great to invest in countries where they probably wouldn't otherwise invest and give a kind of protected forest. I think that's fantastic. I do really recommend that people do it somewhere they can audit. I'm all up for flying to Madagascar and visiting, but it kind of goes against the zero carbon lifestyle, really. But exactly, as long as it comes from somewhere that's, you know, somewhere like gold standard, or it comes from ICROA, you know, that's the thing to look for, as long as it's approved. I would point out, cheap carbon offsetting is going to disappear very quickly when people like some of the airlines say they're going to be zero carbon, or Microsoft say they're going to be zero carbon. We're going to run out very quickly. So it's going to get much more expensive. So just keep an eye out for that.
What I actually would be interested in now, different points. So I think, so earlier on at the beginning during the presentation, Louisa, I think it was Louisa, mentioned that, of course, the term net zero can be used in quite ambiguous terms in the brief. So sometimes it may mean operational carbon, at other times whole life, and obviously it's very important to check assumptions. Are there any other, you know, what may be other issues currently in practice, ambiguities, or ways in which maybe methodology isn't used properly that architects and engineers, you know, need to be aware of, or where we currently maybe communicating, or where this communication may be flawed as well. I don't know if anyone wants to pick up on that.
Joe's shaking his head. I'll hand over to Will, then I'll hook on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say the thing I see quite often is a sort of people conflating the ideas of using less material versus specifying low carbon material or lower carbon alternatives, and they're not interchangeable, and you kind of need to do both. And you need to understand that, you know, Jane made the really good point earlier, that most lower carbon alternatives, so steel with high recycled content, or concretes with cement replacement in them, most of these are based on finite resources that we already use up as much as we have. And so thinking that you can achieve net zero by reducing to meet a target just through hoarding all of the low carbon material is not going to help the industry and where we are. So I think in terms of common misconceptions, that's one, and the thing to do about it is, you know, is start by prioritising reducing the amount of material that you use, get to the point where you've done that as far as you can, base your carbon calculations on the likely material you're going to end up with, and then once you get to the point to talk about material specifications and things, see how much further you could push it, but don't rely on it in the first place. That'll be my sort of add on that.
Thank you. I suppose, God, I had a question in mind. What was it?
Well, whilst you're thinking of that, if I can, I'm going to jump back just briefly to what Jess was answering before about tangible benefits. And I think the one thing we should point out is that quite often, and maybe this is a misconception as well, so maybe it crosses over questions, the idea that a low carbon building has to be expensive is not a particularly well backed idea. You can do a low carbon net zero building for about the same price as a normal building. In fact, you can make it cheaper. And using less materials, using materials more efficiently, reusing what you've already got on site. These are all things that save money, which is why reuse projects have been popular in the past, not just now. And I think that actually one of the big things we can do to help our clients understand early on is that you're not necessarily asking for something that's going to cost you more. And the cost of offsetting at the moment, and Joe's right, it's going to go up. It's going to go up quite dramatically, but at the moment, to offset a project adds about 1% to your project cost by my calculations, if that. So to achieve the net part of net zero is not that expensive. So it should be just be done by a matter of course in my mind.
That's good to know. I actually have now, it was actually a question that had come through in the chat. A viewer asked about designing for adaptability and what you think about any potential trade-offs being made, increasing the initial embodied carbon to hopefully improve adaptability in the long run and therefore save carbon in the long run. I think Will has strong opinions on that.
Well, I better go first, because when we talk about designing for adaptability and flexibility, it's usually the structure that's in the firing line, but I welcome others to jump in after me. I mean, the point we make on this is that if you're making an assumption about what somebody's going to decide to do in 40 years' time with your building, and you're so convinced that the decision they're going to make means that it's worth investing more carbon emissions now to save carbon later, then that's great. But you've got to be, quite how anyone can tell that, I don't know. If you think back to 40 years ago, which would have been the early 1980s, nobody would have been able to foresee where we are now. So to design for future flexibility really is a very sort of treacherous area to go into, I suggest. Designing for adaptability, i.e. building a structure and building facades and things which can be maybe taken apart, strengthened if they need to be, put back together, have components switched in and out, things like that's different, and that's far more sensible, because you can typically design for an adaptable structure with minimal extra carbon today. And it typically just means making sure that things are accessible later down the line and providing good records to help people understand what it was designed for and things like that. But I just want to be clear, we're not confusing this with flexibility and this idea that a 80-metre column grid is the way to solve the climate crisis, because it's fundamentally not.
Thank you. I think Jess also wanted to make a follow-up comment on that.
Yes, it's related. Just in response to Judith's question about many architects thinking that net zero means more compact, more uncomfortable and more boring buildings. I would say, again, that the adaptability and that sort of future flex is quite difficult to achieve when things are very compact and very rigid, and so that kind of is not a good sort of summary, I guess, if that's going to lead us towards net zero. We know from studies that the best performing buildings are the ones which aren't actually that dense, and we also know that there's a sort of sweet spot between operational carbon and embodied carbon. We know that it's very difficult to, there are some gains to be had from building denser in terms of, if we think about residential properties, building denser. But then if you start going very dense, it becomes really, difficult. You reduce daylight, cross ventilation, etc., etc. You have more lifts, and all the kit gets more. So also the embodied carbon increases. So I would refute that we're necessarily going to have more compact and more uncomfortable, boring buildings. Whether we're collecting case studies, yes, but the intention very much with the 2030 climate challenge is to receive case study buildings from signatories, which might not be net zero, but they demonstrate how people have tackled and grappled with the challenge, and it's very much the challenge's aim is to grow industry knowledge, and as been said before in this forum, it's data, and showing and sharing that data, we can just learn together. So that's kind of where we are at, I guess, in terms of that case study collection. We would love to receive some. If you have any, please share them.
Yeah, agree. Thank you. Jane, you wanted to comment.
It was just going back to the adaptable buildings. I made a comment in the chat that I think they say that Georgian terraced housing is the most adaptable building, proven. It's used for almost everything now. If you look in London, those buildings are not particularly high embodied carbon. You don't have to have very fancy ways of making something adaptable or flexible, and I would very much say you shouldn't, because we don't want to have increased impacts now on the off chance that something might be useful in the future.
Joe, go ahead.
Just a quick one. So just picking up those kind of points, the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide, the standards it sets out are, if you're not sure where to start designing a low carbon building, that's where you start. It's not the end for the design. This is an RIBA call. There's a whole raft of people who are all engaged and enthused with low carbon design. Actually, this is where the design starts. This is where you start to respond. This is where your technical expertise becomes really key and important, and where the role of the consultants needs to focus. There's a whole raft of building regs and addressing all this kind of the more tedious stuff, but also there's still an architectural delight that's still about making a building that's fantastic. You can still achieve that, and you don't even need to necessarily measure stuff to know you're doing the right thing. If you know you're going to use slightly less materials, it's probably a better thing. If you know it's going to be less at risk of overheating or going to use slightly less energy, then that's a good thing. I don't think you necessarily need to measure it to understand that you're doing the right thing. It's always great to have a number and fall back on it and say, oh, it'll be great. And I do encourage you all to measure it, because once you start to measure it, you'll get a really good feel for it. But you don't have to. Just use less and make it slightly better. Usually the options are fairly obvious, and when you get down to the complex bits, there's a whole raft of people out there you can ask questions to, talk to LETI or Architects Declare, or ping them an email. There's lots of people out there who will be engaged, and I'm sure we'll be really happy to help.
Fantastic, Joe. That's, I think, actually a good way to end. And maybe just for the last 2 minutes, if someone would like to comment on just to finally outlook, we have a question, someone asking, is actually a net zero certification a realistic prospect, or would it be too difficult to develop a one-size-fits-all approach? I don't know if it would be one-size-fits-all.
I think we still need even more detailed guidance on how to assess embodied and upfront carbon, particularly embodied carbon. There needs to be, more detailed guidance available to ensure a greater consistency, and we are working on that. So the RICS professional statement is a very good step, and we're a lot further down the road than we were, but there would still be a little bit more, in my view, to actually achieve certification.
Okay, which again brings us back to sharing data, and so I mean, I think now.
Sorry, can I just to jump in as well? It'd be an obvious thing not to point out, and the UK GBC have just launched a survey on net zero carbon certification schemes. So if anyone's interested and has 5 minutes after this, please do Google UK GBC net zero certification survey or something. I'll see if I can find a link, put in the chat now, and answer it. It takes about 5 minutes, and it's to get feedback on exactly these sorts of things. What would it need to look like? What are we missing out on? so on and so forth. Jess has beaten me to it. The link's in the chat. Thanks, Jess.
Brilliant. We can also share that again afterwards in an email. So thank you. We've come now to the end of one short hour. Thank you all so very much for sharing your expertise and having that discussion. Really, really helpful. And yeah, we'll be circulating the link to the recording. So if anyone wants to watch again, or again, as Joe said, there are groups out there who are very, very happy to provide more advice. Do reach out, and yeah, thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.